sort of the needs and the interests of an audience. And you can think about this in so many different ways, but one way to think about it is sort of like, general positive sort of aspirations. You might call these dreams, and then sort of more specific types of aspirations. So these are like things that you want to happen, things that you're sort of broadly afraid of, things that you fear. That might be sort of the general negative, and then problems, right? So today, right now, I have this problem. Can you help me? So let's take a look at what that might look like for a government. And this is, I meant to say earlier that I am not an expert in Latin America or the Caribbean, and I am not an expert in development work per se, or most of the categories that you're working in. So you'll have to bear with me. I did my best to try to sort of connect the dots here in a way that's concrete for you guys, but please forgive me if this is like some of the we'll see some headlines later, we'll see some ideas later that are off base. So sort of thinking generally about a government leader, right? We're thinking about maybe sort of dreams, right? Like, how can I improve, broadly the health outcomes for my constituents? And then maybe more specifically, they're thinking about, next month's polling numbers for the election that's coming up. Maybe they're thinking about sort of problems that are happening right now that are, serious issues that are just sort of erupting in the media. But then they're also thinking about sort of longer-term challenges that they have that are concerning them, and they want to have answers. They want to have solutions that they can spend time and build towards. But those are sort of like longer-term, and sort of thinking about sort of how do we address those different feelings and concerns and hopes that this category might have. And of course, that looks very different from maybe how the thought leader category, in this case, maybe more like an academic or something, sort of thinking about trends from their students. Maybe they're thinking about, right, at this next conference, right? Let's be really, really honest, right? They're going to a conference. It's on this topic. What can they say at the panel when everyone else says all the things that they were going to say? What can they bring out there that's going to sound smart, right? And you want to give them. That's why they might want to come to you, is to be armed with interesting facts or insights or new stories that they can tell, because otherwise they're going to keep telling the same old stories, same old reports. The problem side of that is sort of they're trying to write something, they're trying to publish a paper, but they can't find good data. They can't find something that's working for them, that's credible, and you guys can potentially be the source for that data. And then sort of longer term concerns, right, around making sure that their work stays relevant, that their work is seen as being on the cutting edge. And this is, again, something where you can play a role. And then the general public, right? The general public has a lot of needs and wants that maybe you're not going to serve, right? Sort of who's on the Voice, the next, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter the celebrity gossip. There's a lot of things that people care about, but sort of things that maybe you guys can help with are also their interest in what is the future for their children. Can they trust government to do the work that they're hoping can be done for them? Maybe some questions about why prices are rising or why this is happening. I want to understand, and maybe thinking about sort of their goals. They want to move up. They want to be healthier. They want to be more economically in a good position. And how can they personally do that, or how can they understand what's going on so they can do that? So understanding audiences. I imagine you guys spend time talking to your audience, to whether that's the government leaders or the business community or the NGOs and the academics and the general public. But how can you do that in a strategic way? How can you make that a consistent part of your work, so it's not just, oh, you bump into somebody at a conference and you talk for a little bit, hey, how are things going? And more of a sort of strategic thing that you're doing consistently, because we know that things change too, that 1 month to the next month, 1 quarter to the next quarter, things are always changing. With blogs that already have some readership, one thing that can be done is sort of doing a survey, right? It seems so simple, but it's something that you often, what you'll see is people hook it up to a kind of a giveaway. And I don't know what the policies are around for something like this, but you can say sort of, we'll give away something small like a book on the topic that you guys write about. This is something that the readers who read your blog would be interested in, and then you take a survey. Who are you why do you read this blog? What are you looking for? Sort of what are you thinking? Looking at competitors. I know that someone talked about being competitive, right? And that competition, they're probably putting out content too. And it's not to say that, oh, theirs is obviously right, but sort of understanding when something does bubble up, when a story or a blog that seems to be stand out, what are they doing that's working for them, and how can maybe you model that? And then finally, sort of just looking at your own content and looking at the analytics and seeing what do people search for, what are people finding again and again, what are people sharing? And those give you some of those clues and insights into what your audience cares about. So we'll take a second and do a little Q&A on audience, and then I'm going to ask you guys to do some note-taking. So content ideas, I think this is where we can really dive in deep. A lot of this is about saying we've got this big body of knowledge over here, and how do we chunk that up, right? Because a big part of it is that any one blog post isn't going to be everything, and even the big reports that we write can sort of skip out on things, or no one reads them, or by the time they come out, they're already a little bit out of date. And so how do we take our content ideas and package them in ways that people are going to read, people are going to share, and people are going to use? So I'm breaking these into beginner, intermediate, advanced, because I know that there's a sort of a range of work that you guys are doing in terms of how comfortable you and your team are with blogging and things like that. So we'll start with the beginner stuff. List posts. This is fairly in the industry, sometimes they're called listicles because they're like not even real articles, they're just lists of things. But people love lists. People love to know they're going to see a number, they're going to have an idea of what it's going to be, and then you just put bullet points. You give a headline. You say 6 reasons why Rio is an emerging leader in this area, and then you just put a bullet point, and you have a little short headline because they have more solar panels than anybody else in the region, and then you just write a few sentences about elaborating on that, and maybe you put a link to it, maybe you don't, and you just go down the list and you sort of chunk it out. They don't even have to be that related to each other, as long as there's like a general theme that ties this sort of list post together. It's useful. It's something that people can consume. They'll probably forget 90% of it, but maybe there's one bullet point, maybe there's one list article section that they're going to remember for the future, right? And that's okay. That's okay if that's all they get out of it. But so lists are a really simple way to just you put a number down and you just start writing until you have 5 points, and then you elaborate, and then you're done. And it can be pretty tight. So key fact post, this is sometimes even shorter than list is, can be kind of long. It can be fairly long if you want to make it one of those like 57 something. But key fact posts are sort of like one specific fact and then telling the story behind that fact. Planet Money is a podcast that I listen to, and one of the things they used to do was like the number of the day, and they would do this number of the day, and the number it'd be like 850,000, and what is that number? Well, that's the number of new jobs created in the last quarter, and why this number matters is that it's less than the quarter before that, and so we're slowing our job growth, and then you kind of tell a story about this fact, right? Or 44%, you see, we'll talk more about headlines because I think it's good to sort of, in some ways, bury the lead a little bit. You don't give them everything in the headline, but we'll talk more about that. Sort of, why does it matter that this youth say that their phones are more important than like sleep, right? And then you start talking about cell phone usage, and you start talking about the lifestyles that people are living in this time and now, and sort of elaborate on. But it starts with that big fact. So that's another way to kind of do this. Similar to the big fact is the quote or the commentary. This is, some people might call this lazy journalism, but I think that the fact is our media does this all the time, and people will click on this stuff all the time, so you want to be out there doing it. President gives a speech, you quote 3 or 4 sections of the speech, you add a sentence, you add a paragraph, whatever works for you, and then you just explain why this is interesting. You can talk about what we learned, you can talk about shocking, you can talk, you can have an angle, but you just talk about something that someone else has already written. all right? Or you have a quote, right? You have this quote that from a book or from something else. It doesn't matter if the book was published like 3 years ago. If most people haven't read that book, they probably haven't read that section. If they read that section, they probably forgot. Doesn't matter. You can bring it back out and talk about why this quote is relevant now. So that's another way to do this. Regular features. People really like things that sort of come on a rhythm, on a system, and so you can do like Money Mondays, and then the post doesn't have to be that long, but it's just like something, and that's what makes it like relevant, is that it's this like thing that comes every Monday, and some Mondays it's a little weak. It's like, oh, did you know that this coin is made out of 50% bronze, 50%, but it's something, and people sort of, and then you can kind of like look at the backlog, and you can kind of see all these things that come out over time. And at the Smithsonian, the Smithsonian Institution Archives does this thing called like Women in Science Wednesdays, and they've gotten featured for that because they just pull out another woman each time, and it's interesting. Sorry, this is like the binders full of. Because I'm thinking about the archives, and they just have all these people and stories that aren't being told, and they sort of give a little bit of information, and they link to sort of like the longer story, but that's their version of a regular feature, and that's something that can be fairly simple that you can do. So now we're moving into intermediate. Case studies are something that people really love because most of the time they're not getting on-the-ground information, or they don't get to see a whole story. Maybe they get a bullet point at the end, like this thing launches, but what you really want to know is the whole story. How did it go from this idea to, what were the challenges involved, and then how did they get it all the way to the end point, and then what were the results, right? And you can write about the work that IDB is doing. You can write about other people's projects. You can write about just different kinds of stories. What is going on, and telling that narrative is really valuable, and people really appreciate that. So this is this is a little bit more challenging because you have to get all the facts, you have to find out on the information, and you can make it really in-depth, or you can kind of make it relatively tight, but both of those can be valuable, especially if you have some sort of concrete numbers around it, because people often don't get numbers, and they want to hear the number. Profiles, similar, but focusing on a person rather than on a sort of situation or initiative. Thinking about, and sometimes this can be an interview, you spend time with somebody, but then you're not, an interview is more like you just quote what they say, but this is more like telling their story. How did they get from where they were to where they are now? And you can find people in your field, and you can tell those stories. If someone new emerges, if even someone who's maybe, not the head of X organization, but somebody who's been involved in a movement or in a situation, or just someone who's been affected by something, and just getting their story out there it can be really important. How-to guides. I think about these a lot because I think about giving people sort of tactics and strategies for doing their startup or doing in their career or whatever. And it may be more challenging on the issues that you guys are working on because they're so large and they're so significant. But I think that there's still a lot of value in looking at this. You can either look at it big picture, right? You can. Planet Money did a podcast on how you turn around a brand, and they were talking about how Audi was trying to turned around their brand, and then how Ford or Lincoln is trying to turn around their brand. It was sort of like, step one, hire a really cool designer. Step two, spend a lot of money on, it's just sort of like really ridiculously large steps, but it can still be a good framework for thinking about an issue, thinking about how we solve an issue, and that's something that people want to read. So, and then this is one of those ones where definitely you want to think a lot about the audience. Some posts might make sense for a variety of audiences, but this is one of those where it's like, well, how to depends on what kind of resources I have, what kind of goals I have, who I'm trying to sort of do this for, and so this is where audience really makes a difference. Interviews with experts. I'm sure you guys have done interviews in the past, but just having that in the toolkit of types of things that you're writing about. And there's a lot of different ways to do interviews. I think the way that is the most flat is just you quote everything they say, you quote everything, you transcribe it, and just dump it. Maybe you have the questions interspersed, maybe you combine it. But I think what's better is to even sort of take away your questions, because your questions kind of inserts you into this experience, when really what you're trying to do is like grab the experience directly out of the expert. And so sort of having them say like on, on globalization, and then just quoting what they said about that, and then it kind of becomes like this list thing where you have their 10 things that they said. But I think people appreciate that style, and it's fairly easy to do, and it doesn't overwhelm them with like a ton of content. You can even turn it into like 3 or 4 posts, right? You take one interview, and then you quote mainly on one section, and then you quote the next part, and then you quote the next one. Now you got 3 articles, right? 3 for 1, that's a good deal. So revisiting older material, this is something that, if you have a blog that you've already written about, or even, another event that has happened and has been significant, you can come back and say, you get to quote a big section of what you already wrote or someone else already wrote, and then you add to that and say, update, what's happened since then? What have we done? What have we learned? How has it changed? And again, all my headlines totally made up, but hopefully trying to get that concrete, getting you, churning on ideas on what you could write about. Revisiting older material is something that can be helpful. I know that some blogs will do this thing where they'll do like from the archives, and they'll just repost an old blog post. If your blog's 5 years old, no one's reading every single thing from a year ago, and then you can just, if you want to add something, that's even better. OK, so I guess we're in the advanced. OK, now we're moving to the advanced. So the big series. This gets a ton of links. This gets a ton of traffic, but it's a lot of work, right? It's the complete guide to something, or it's the like everything you wanted to know about X, and then you break it down, and you have 10 really meaty posts, each one of them breaking down a specific area of your topic, and you're pulling in sort of the research, you're pulling in the experts, you're pulling in all this, the data, all this information, and you're making it sort of digestible, right? The focus is still not just saying this is a report, this is what's happening, but it's about how should you be thinking about this? What can why is this important? Why do you need to understand this? Here are the things that you really need to know about a particular topic. Analysis of data. This is something that most of the people don't have the time to do, or maybe don't even have the skills to do, is sort of take a bunch of data that's raw data that's been released and crunch it and sort of come up with something that's really useful, some information that's really helpful, right? There's this dating site called OkCupid, and they have a blog called OK Trends. And basically, the blog is all just crunching the data of information that people already have, right? So it's so fascinating because you can't really, if they're not saying, oh, I noticed this or I noticed that, but it's just people who are taller tend to date, have the partner be really short, whatever it is. They just tell you the correlation, right? These are the words that come up most when somebody is of this gender or of this race or of this age group or in this city, right? And, that stuff is so fascinating because most of the time people don't have access to that data, but it sort of reveals things that maybe they already believed, maybe they were surprised to believe, and it can be really valuable. But it's a lot of work, right? Because you want to make sure that these insights are legitimate. Comparisons and debates. This can get you into tricky territory because it can be, touching on those controversial topics. But I think it's the kind of thing that people are really looking for. I mean, you can kind of do, and I assume that you probably wouldn't want to do like super controversial stuff where just like it has to be X, right? But you can say X or Y, pros and cons, and then you really want to represent each side fairly so that both sides are coming to the table and reading this article and not feeling like IDB is biased and IDB has is all about this one area. Sort of we all know that both sides often have good ideas, and sort of unpacking that is what you guys can do and show your expertise in saying, here's a holistic way to think about this debate. So headlines. This might seem like a very specific topic, but it's so important. And so we'll just jump right to it.